Thank you so much for joining us here at the Clayman Institute for Gender Research series, Feminism in Theory and Practice. My name is Moira Donegan. I am the writer in residence here at Clayman, and I am really thrilled that today we get to welcome Jamie Hood, who is a writer, a critic, and a bartender in New York, and for my money, one of the most interesting feminist writers working. Her latest book, Trauma Plot: A Life, draws on disparate literary forms to tell the story of 3 decades marred by sexual violence and the wreckage left behind. Hood interrogates the archetype of the rape survivor who must perform penitence long after living through the unthinkable. She's here to talk with us about that book today, but Hood is also the author of How to Be a Good Girl, which has just been reissued. It's one of Vogue's best books of 2020, and Regards Marcel, which is a monthly newsletter on Proust and other miscellany. Her essays and criticism have appeared in The Baffler, Book Forum, The Nation, the Los Angeles Review of Books, The New Inquiry, The Drift, and elsewhere. And Jamie, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Very excited to be here, Moira. Thank you for having me.
So today we're discussing Trauma Plot. And Jamie, I want to get into your reading, but first I want to just give a content note for everybody who's joining us today that this is a really difficult, serious book that talks about suffering and its aftermath in elegant terms, and its accomplishment is continuous with the heaviness of the material, right? So this is a book that deals with sexual violence. It is a book that deals with substance abuse, with sex work, with sort of personal disintegration in ways that I think you deal with really deftly. But it's also something that everybody should just be aware of, that we're going to be talking about this kind of subject matter in some detail because you deal with it with uncommon intelligence, I think. So Jamie, do you want to start us off with just a little bit of reading from your excellent new memoir? Because I think people should get a taste of the prose style, which I think is so accomplished.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm going to read. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you did the content warning. I think I'm going to read a pretty intense part, which I have not read yet. You kind of end up doing like the same excerpts when you do so many events, and I haven't read from this part yet, but so we can get into the form later, but basically this is from the final chapter of the book, which is set basically in the present day, and it's sort of organized as dialogues with my therapist. And this sequence, I'm kind of unearthing the last assault that I endured, which was in 2015. What details remain salient, asks Helen, if it feels useful to particularize the experience in that way. If you want to continue down this path, I mean, you don't have to. I hope you know this. I am absolutely still, not breathing. I consider turning back. I could shut my ears against the call, refuse the memory, stuff it under 1,000 layers of silt, and don't. To Helen, I say no. That's helpful. I say there were 4 men, a couch, sad and old and beige. I feel sure of the color. I seem to remember them all smoking cigars, but it might have been just one, or maybe 2. At least one, though, I tell Helen, because the air was thick with smoke, and it's different with cigars than weed or cigarettes. It hangs heavier, like you're in a room where a fog machine's been running. Besides, the odor was familiar. My redacted smoked them constantly. His walls were caked in tar, and I'd get nauseous whenever we visited his house. He was a bad man. Probably still is, but that's for another session. I knew one of the men, the one who carried me to the apartment. I probably mentioned him. He was a regular at the dive bar where I'd been recently fired, a coke dealer, and his shit was bad. The drip always tasted like gasoline, but everyone bought it when the guy with the good shit wasn't working. He used different names with different people, I realized later. To me, he was Pierre, which was funny because there wasn't an atom of Frenchness about him. He was really proud of being from Brooklyn. He hated the transplants taking over Bed-Stuy, and I, of course, was one of these, so it didn't matter that I was poor and living on couches or that I was hooking. I wasn't from here, so I was one of them, no different from the trust fund kids at Pratt, no different from the snobby Nepo babies who looked down on him while they bought their baggies. Despite myself, I represented the elite. Occasionally, I guess, the facts matter less than the feeling of a thing. Pierre was handsome, I can admit that much. He had a striking face, cut jaw, strong chin, low forehead, but with delicate eyes and pillowy lips. I'll know that face forever. Of all my rapists, he's the one I'm branded by, his image entirely eternal. In the apartment where they were taking turns on me, I remember their laughter. I remember thinking to myself, what's so fucking funny? Like I'd caught the second half of a joke one of them told, a joke from which I'd been ejected. Later, I'd think, my God, you stupid bitch. You were the joke. Because of course I was. What a laugh. It wasn't easy situating myself in the moment. There was the smoke and the roofies, and the room, of course, was a mess of limbs. I just kept being filled, like every time I thought it was over, my face was shoved in another lap, another pair of hands grabbed my hips, repositioned me, tugged me backward. Again, I tore. My body seemed sort of gluey, like there was no flesh or bone or blood in it anymore. I seemed to be without sensation, nerveless, kind of, and because of that, I wasn't as scared as the other times. I was dead already. There were even moments I felt bored, which probably sounds crazy, but by this time, you have to remember, I'd been getting raped with some regularity for 20 years. Any pain can become banal. I asked myself how long it would take, as in how many hours can 4 men spend on one woman? And as I thought this, I saw it might go on a long while. I was sort of in and out, but I longed for sleep. I just wanted to see my dog. I remember wondering if they felt gay because these were all really macho guys, right? And I was thinking how they all had their cocks out in front of one another. So it occurred to me this might undermine their masculinity somehow. But I guess it wasn't about them, or they'd rationalized the event in some other way. Maybe forcing me affirmed something more profound for them about their manhood. Maybe raping me helped them feel impervious, invulnerable, utterly unkillable. There was a moment when my head wasn't being held down, and I was able, for just that instant, to glance around me, and I saw another room. Its door was ajar, and in it I saw the shadow of a bed, and the outline of another man sitting on it. I guess a fifth man, the non-participant. Or anyway, I don't remember him joining the group, but like I said, I was between states. And in the middle of the body's outline was a small red light blinking back at me through the darkness, like the light of a camcorder as it's recording, so that I saw then what was happening was bigger than I understood, or more serious, because the non-participant was making a document of what was being done to me, and this fact made it suddenly impossible that I separate from the scene entirely, as I'd been doing, because the scene existed now in a more material way. It was in the process of being immortalized, and all the dissociation in the world wouldn't erase that. My first thought on waking the next day was practical. What if the video gets out? Of course, I thought the rape was my fault. It didn't matter I'd been drugged. It didn't matter there were 5 men, and they were all huge, and I was being held down. These truths were tertiary to the plot, which was that I was a slut, and I'd been doing Pierre's coke with him in the bar bathroom on and off for months, that I'd left my drink unattended on the bar like an idiot, and that, this was essential, these men had put me back in my place. Rape girl. Everything I'd done in the 30 months since my last assault was diversionary. I'd merely costumed myself in someone else's life, and done it badly, besides. So I worried, mainly, about the video, as I was sure if it circulated, it would be interpreted as porn, that everyone I knew would think I'd just gotten myself caught up in some Girls Gone Wild scheme. It seemed impossible I see the recording for what it was, evidence. Anyway, it never did surface, but I couldn't fathom even one person believing me. And that doubt remains. It's in me now. It's hard to think anyone has ever believed me. I mean, I never reported, so there's no documentation but my own account. And people love nothing more than poking holes in women's stories. There will never not be people who say, well, I think she's lying. I think she's doing it for attention or money, or she's seeking revenge, trying to ruin some poor man's life. Like this attention never goes well for a woman. Imagine hearing about Christine Blasey Ford going into hiding after the hearings and thinking, I bet she sure loved all that attention. Imagine seeing what happened to Amber Heard and thinking, here's that attention you ordered, mama. I'm not even naming anyone. There's one man in the entire book who people could, with great diligence, identify, and he's already been found out. But I have to remember, I'm not writing this to be believed. I'm writing to open space in myself for other books, to offer solace, I hope, to others who've lived through this. I can't write for my worst readers, and there's no amount of evidence that would satiate people. There's nothing to do or say that could make a person good enough as a victim. It's why people like us best when we're dead, as if death is the only proof possible, like, oh dear, see what happened to that poor girl, and now she's gone. Better we can't speak. Better our corpses be the books left behind us, interpretable to everyone but ourselves. I'm mindful of our time, Helen says now, but I want to ask, are you okay in this moment? Yes, I tell her. In fact, I feel sort of indignant. I feel fired up. Email me if anything, she says. Until next week.
Jamie, thank you so much. You know, the book is about a lifetime of sexual violence, but it is sort of grounded in these three incidents of rape, two in Boston, where you went to graduate school, and then this last one in New York. And for a lot of the book, when I first read it, I thought that this last rape would not be depicted, right? It's like a lacuna in the book for quite a long time. And I think that withholding until this moment that you just so generously read for us has this power of doing what this book does for much of its duration really deftly, which is articulate the indescribability of rape and its aftermath, right? The way it sort of exceeds language, or maybe more precisely, kind of renders a lot of language sort of pointless. And what I wanted to ask you about, and let's just get right into it. Sorry, I'm not going to start on a light, easy question. Is like, what was it like to write this book? What was that creative process like for you?
Like emotionally, you mean?
I guess I'm not really articulating a difference between the emotional and the intellectual experience because I'm not sure where that line would be here. But yeah,
Sure.
in general.
Difficult. I mean, it was incredibly difficult. And, you know, it's funny you point out that you thought that that scene would be sort of an absence in the book, because I also didn't think I was going to write it into the text of the book. I allude to it on the very first page, and I kind of knew I would get into the other ones. And for whatever reason, I thought maybe I would just sort of let this final one be a strange ghost in the corner of the room. And then I was writing the therapy section which this is from, and I just felt like I was sort of running away from telling something because I was scared of it myself, or I didn't want to confront people or make them feel uncomfortable or triggered, to use that word. But actually, like it felt important to sort of understand how to sit in and live in discomfort, and to articulate fear, and to articulate also, I think, in an important way, to articulate the sort of corporeal experience of rape. I was worried that maybe I was going to be orienting towards prurient interest, like, oh, I have to leave these things kind of sketched, like outlined, or otherwise it's going to be people reading these events as if they're porn, like as if it's like smut that I'm offering. Um, but rape happens to bodies, and the sort of physical mechanics of the event seem to me as important as the sort of political stakes and the intellectual um, knot that I was trying to disentangle in the book. And so that was kind of like the fine line that I felt I tiptoed through a lot of the book, which was just sort of like when I sort of began it, one of the ways that I really protected myself in an emotional sense was by treating rape as an intellectual problem. Um, and the original version of the book was going to be much more a work of literary criticism. And I kind of saw that what I was doing by enforcing this like very minute, very cerebral scaffold on the text that I was trying to write was like avoiding what had happened to me. But I still wanted to preserve that because I do think like rape is something that did happen to my body, is a physical thing, like a physical form of suffering that I endured and dealt with and responded badly to in bodily matters and bodily senses. And also seems to me something that is important to write about in ways that are maybe not as physical. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but like sort of drawing somewhere in the middle between the intellectual and the sort of intimate, like felt very urgent to me. Um, but it was a difficult book to write. Like I was sitting in this shit for 8 hours a day for months and months and months. And there were days where it felt very impossible.
Tell me about the structure you chose for the book. So you've got it, I have the table of contents here from my galley, but I do have a finished copy behind me. So everybody should look at this. They gave you a beautiful cover. So I think you should be very proud of it. It's a gorgeous book, but you structured it into 4 parts, which you build around these pronouns in which you sort of address yourself almost from these different vantage points. Part 1 is she, and it's told in the third person. Part 2 is I in the first person. Part 3 is you, and I found this part very moving, where you're sort of addressing your past self, often through like encounters with your diaries from this former part of your life. And then part 4, which you read from, was we, which is largely about your experiences enrolling in therapy, like while you're also drafting the manuscript. So it has this sort of like metacritical element to it. What made you settle on that form and all these different positionalities in relation to yourself?
It was sort of happenstance, honestly. Everyone, it's a great question. And I know why everyone sort of wants to ask it. And it's one of those places, and you know this, I'm sure, which is like when you're writing, sometimes the problem just sort of resolves itself. And it's not like a matter of being like this sort of, I don't know. I want to be like, I was a genius. And when I set out to write this book, I said it's going to be in 4 parts and it's going to be these parts. And I know exactly what I'm doing. But sometimes writing kind of knows more than you do. And like I said, like there was a very elaborate labyrinthine scaffolding that I had created for the book when I had it on submission to publishers and I was trying to sell the book, where it was going to be 3 parts that were kind of about me and like memoiristic, and they were all going to be, I was going to experiment some, but they were all going to be in the first person. And then there were going to be 3 parts that were poetry. And then there were going to be 3 parts that were literary criticism. And I just sort of kept scaling back and scaling back and scaling back in the process of the writing. And like I was saying before, I realized that I was kind of running from the story. I needed to face it head on. And there's a part, the first chapter of the book is written as an homage to Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway. And originally that was also just sort of first person, that was first person memoir, and it wasn't working. And I thought to myself when I was working on it, I was working on that in the second chapter, which is, I think, the chapter that's closest to sort of conventional memoir. I was working on those two chapters at the same time. And I thought to myself, well, what if I wrote this Mrs. Dalloway chapter in the third person? Like, what if I imagined myself as a character that I'm sort of um, maneuvering through a day? And it opened the whole book up for me. Like, it opened that chapter up for me because I think that chapter is so much um, interested in the problem of dissociation in the wake of trauma. And to write about myself as if I'm not myself or as if I'm looking at myself as a character kind of helped me map dissociation onto a formal dynamic. And it also like kind of allowed me to play a bit in a way that I don't think memoirs often feel at liberty to play. And I don't call it a memoir either. I call it a life. And that felt sort of important to me because I didn't want to be chained to like the sense that I was creating a police report or something, but this is not a legal deposition. And so like being able to sort of have a sense of play and a sense of experimentalism in it. I mean, there's certainly a tradition for experimental memoirs, and I wanted to do something that was a little strange. And once I had that happening in the first chapter, um, it really, for one thing, it also allowed me to sort of turn to that work from a place of more distance. Like the first person memoir is often very emotionally difficult to write. But when I sort of was able to be like, what if I step back and I'm writing about, yes, Jamie H., this character that I'm dealing with, and all these horrible things happen to her, but there's like a sense of remove in a way. So I think it helps me like sort of have this emotional buffer zone in a way. Um, but it also just like enabled me to sort of recalibrate the rest of the book and to say, okay, I am going to do this like first person thing in the second chapter. But then it kind of opened up a place where I also did in the third chapter where I'm like working with my diaries, I was like, oh, I was just going to do them as like a collage where I'm just sort of assembling this essentially like a biography of my previous life or like my, an earlier version of myself through my old diaries. And I thought, like, what if I actually sort of addressed that self? And that was where the second person came in and sort of like imagining my present writing self as someone who had like a very complicated relationship reading my old diaries and looking at them and feeling very, having a feeling of real callousness toward my younger self, and trying to actually reckon with that as opposed to avoiding it, as opposed to pretending I was an objective observer of my younger self who was going through all of this shit. Um, yeah, I'm sort of rambling, but
No,
the
you get mad at her sometimes
I
in
do.
your diary. Yeah, when you're reading your diaries and you're like, you get mad at her for what seems like her efforts at avoidance. You get mad at her for what seems like her dishonesty in her diaries. Uh, you get mad at her and then also almost apologize. I think one of the most moving passages is when you talk about your work as an excavator of the past, almost doing what you contemplate as maybe a kind of violence and trying to impose like causation on the actions of this past version of yourself. And I think it occurs to me that like one of the things um that the traumatic psychic experience does is sort of like disintegrate time, right? You actually write very movingly of something that I've never seen depicted before, which is like the mental state of sort of being absent from your own life, in a way in which, time just sort of has to pass almost without your participation for a while in the wake of a traumatic experience. And then what you're doing with this memoir gesture is trying to make sense of something that you could not make sense of at the time and to impose an order on something where order was sort of beyond your grasp at the time. How do you feel now in relation to that past self now that you've like sort of exposed her in this way and put her all out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think even in the process of the book, like I was really figuring out a way, and this thanks in large part to being in therapy while I was writing it. Um, I was sort of able to forgive myself in a lot of ways, you know? Like I think it's true that like I really wasn't present. Like I was sort of I talk about myself as sort of like the walking dead in my own life. And it did feel like that. Or it felt like nothing, I guess is the better way of putting it. Like I felt like nothing. I felt nothing. I was numb. And so like yeah, you know, especially in the chapter where I'm sort of addressing my younger self, I was watching sort of like going through my diaries and like at first I felt very resistant to it. Like I looked at them and I was like, "Oh God, this is so horrible. It's so embarrassing. It's so difficult to read." And then I became like utterly engrossed. And that was when I like really decided to make a chapter where I devoted the chapter entirely to stuff that had been assembled from the diaries. Um and yeah, I mean, I do get angry at myself. I think that, and that was a lot of residual sort of internalized misogyny and internalize the way that we internalize and are indoctrinated into rape culture, which is to say, like, looking at myself and saying, oh, like, my response to being raped was to like do a lot of drugs and fuck a lot of guys, you know, and to be angry at that response. But like, what is telling me to feel anger at that, you know, like why must I believe that I like the only proper way to um navigate the wake of like a series of rapes is to like become a nun and to like or have a mental breakdown. I mean, I kind of did have a mental breakdown, but like not in the maybe not in the Lifetime movie kind of way. um but you know, like a lot of the hatred that I was sort of spewing on myself was because I had totally been brainwashed by a culture that both systematically subjects women to rape and then disciplines every possible reaction women have to being subjected to systematic rape. So, you know, and so I think like kind of looking back and determining a way to like both recognize that I maybe wouldn't behave in certain ways again. Um, or I can look at myself and say, yes, I feel embarrassed about this, or I feel shame, but I also like am able to make peace with it and to say like, you know, that does not much in the way that my having been raped does not define my entire life, nor does me, you know, having a couple years where I partied all the time because I couldn't deal with what had fucking happened to me, like that also is not determinative of the horizon of possibility for the rest of my life, you know?
Yeah, there's so much there. There's one passage I like just kind of drew a big line next to because something that really struck me in your narrations of this violence is that you are interpreting your own experience even as it's happening sometimes in the light of all the ways it would be narratively minimized or dismissed if you were going to try and relay it, right? So the the violence as violence is experienced not just as violence, but also in terms of its like violent incommunicability, right? Like you're also dealing with rape myths like while you're being raped, right? And there's this one passage you have. Um, Spectators feel unable to track the plot. The narrative becomes less intelligible, but that's because of rape culture and misogyny. It's because of this kaleidoscopic matrix of anti-feminist rhetoric. If you produce this impossible ontology of the perfect victim, so no one's able to embody it, you create the conditions for systemic incredulity, the fiction that sexual violence doesn't happen or isn't serious, that it is endemic to life under patriarchy. The fact that I slept with a lot of men in the wake of my rapes becomes a crack in the porcelain. Now people can claim the assaults were only reverberations of my usual bodily habits, or say I misunderstood some foggy non-distinction between them and the sex I agreed to. I think, too, of my time escorting and the decision to write about it now. How will this render me even less credible for many people? So it's like this, there's a metacritical element, right? Where the experience of violence comes packaged with this like epistemic discrediting, right? And this like narrative undercutting, which might bring me to what I think is like kind of one of the fun. I mean, I'm making it sound like and it is, it's a very difficult book, right? It's a heavy book. It's a book that I couldn't put down and also felt like really dysregulated by. And I'd like walk around feeling like various kinds of like grief and shame and then like desire to just go back to the book. So I had a time reading you, Jamie. I feel like I'm going to become a Jamie Hood completist now and like read everything. But it's also kind of funny. Um in like
Yeah.
ways that are like surprising. Like I didn't like to my great shame, I didn't realize that in that first part, part one, where you go through a day between like the first and second of these like major rape events, where you're just sort of navigating the psychic aftermath of trauma and trying to get back into the world as a graduate student at Brandeis, right? And then you have this moment where you're trying to go teach a class and there's like a huge turkey for like a wild turkey in front of the like door to the building where you're gonna go teach. And like this other guy in your cohort has to like come and like scare it away so that you can go to class. And like somehow that's when I realized that you were doing Mrs. Dalloway. Because it had this like texture of the absurd or like the comical that can be like symbolically laden and also sort of like brings you back into like the humility of reality, right? How did you deal with comedy? And then I want you to talk about your title because I think your title is like one of the like more winking provocations of this book.
Yeah. The thing is with comedy, I sort of got asked this at the launch night I did at McNally Jackson. Um, and I couldn't remember the idiom, right? It was something like, if you don't laugh, I think I was just like, if you don't laugh, you'll kill yourself, which is how I felt, it was like, if I don't laugh, I'm going to kill myself. And I think that, comedy, sort of being able to sort of not treat my trauma as light, because I don't think it is, and I don't think this kind of violence ever is. But I think being able to sort of have a kind of like dark humor about this sort of experience of suffering has been one of the things that enabled me to remain agile, and adaptive. And I had to be a real survivalist for a long time, like I went through it, but I mean, there are other things that made life difficult for me. Like I was in deep economic precarity for a really long time. And during the progress of these events. So it's sort of like I'm also navigating like not being able to put food on the table, Like I'm also navigating living on couches, and I was living on a friend's couch during that last rape. And there's a part later in that scene that I recount when I get back to the house and all of the dogs sort of surround me, which was true. I was like living on her couch. She had four dogs, and I had my dog. And then she was also a dog walker and dog sitter. So sometimes there'd be like seven dogs in this tiny ground floor apartment and like this really shitty block in Bed-Stuy. And so like I came home that night or like early morning, and like that was the thing that sort of saved me. But it was also kind of it's kind of a little comical to walk in from being gang raped and just be sort of like enmeshed in like a group of seven dogs, and they're all just sort of like there to take care of me. But it's also a little like slapsticky. Or at least in my fucked up imagination, it's a little funny to like collapse on a couch and like have a million dogs sort of just checking in and like making sure I'm okay. Um, and so yeah, I mean, yeah, comedy is just sort of like maybe part of what saved me, I guess. I think I do have like a very darkly comic way of imagining the world. And I also thought it was sort of important to me. There are so many things about the book that I wanted to hold on to that I felt very uneasy about, because of that sort of meta that sort of anticipatory relation to like rape apologism or people finding me to be a discreditable witness or whatever of my own experience. Like that was part of why I wrote about all the drugs and the fucking and the boozing, because I was like, yeah, I'm not a fucking perfect victim. If I wanted to be a perfect victim, I would have written a totally different book if I wanted to present myself in that way, and it would have been dishonest. And so I think like I had to be honest about the fact that I was a party girl, and I did a lot of things that maybe I wouldn't do now that had also did not mean that I deserved to be raped. Um, and I wanted to be able to have comedy be part of this because I think there's something important about the fact that, like, even a life of suffering has moments of laughter and has moments of joy. Like, I still had friends, I still had good sex sometimes. Like, I still, like experienced pleasure and like not a lot of it because of where my life was, but those moments happened, and it doesn't feel to me that I have to, the other thing I don't feel like I have to prove is that I'm a credible witness by suggesting that I was always in the thick of trauma, or that I never had a sense of humor about things. I think there's something so you know, there's always this idea that, especially with comedy and like as a form, that, in this moment, we're all too PC, we're too woke or whatever. And it's like, I think it's possible to make a rape joke. I just think it's the onus is on the people who survived rape to figure out how we want to make jokes about rape. Like I don't think some fucking creep who hates women is the one who should be making rape jokes or like deciding what the parameters of possibility for a rape joke might look like. Like that should be something that is like our decision to do.
So I think you're like touching on something that I want to get into, which is the politics of writing a rape book, like a rape memoir. In a moment of backlash against feminism very broadly, against Me Too in particular, and really in the granular, like a backlash and sort of like critical rejection of like women's confessional writing more broadly, right? What is, because I feel, maybe you don't feel this way, but I feel like you're making like a kind of a defiant statement by writing and publishing this book in this moment, right? It's against the grain, it's off trend, and it's a formal innovation or a formal intervention that has like some political echoes, right? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, yeah, it's very out of fashion, like you're right. We are in a backlash moment. I think frankly, like the backlash moment is the thing that propelled me to actually write the book. Um, or to publish the book rather. I'd been working on it on and off for a very long time. And there were a number of moments where I was like, this is not worth it. I think when Me Too happened, I felt a level of ambivalence, at least in relation to the publishing, apparatus or why it would matter that I did. I think partly because I was like, well, what do I have to add to this deluge of stories? There's so many stories. What does mine matter? Like it's one more drop in a flood. Um, and at that point, I was pretty open and interpersonally about what had happened to me. Like I talked to friends about it. I went to protests. Um, I was not keeping it secret anymore. But whether or not there was writing a book and publishing a book was a necessity or would help anyone felt uncertain to me in that moment. And then, a lot of the sort of things that I talk about in the introduction that we saw happen, like the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings, I feel like that was such a chilling moment for people.
As an
Um,
aside, people should buy the book for the introduction alone, which is one of the best critical treatments of the Me Too survivor story and its place in our popular discourses that I've ever read. It's really, really smart, Jamie. But one of the things you talk about is watching Brett Kavanaugh and grappling with like the futility of storytelling as a political tool in some senses.
yeah, and I cite Christine Blasey Ford's memoir in that moment as well, where she talks about the fact that she didn't even feel like she wasn't believed. Like Trump said that she was credible, Trump himself. But that people were just like, well, whatever, who gives a shit? Like it just didn't matter. And I do think that that's kind of what it felt like as an outsider watching it happen, which was like there's never going to be a perfect victim. You know, there's never going to be someone who can provide enough um, in terms of moral standing or evidentiary claims for people to be like, yes, this is the one we believe, and we are going to change the circumstances that allow this to happen. So there was like a deeply demoralizing feeling to that moment. But I also think, so yeah, when that happened, I was sort of like, well, what's the point? Um, and honestly, I think sort of what compelled me to do it, also just like the backlash to Me Too happened coincident with Me Too's emergence. Like, when did the hashtag go viral? October 2017. By December, the Times, the Atlantic, all these places, the Washington Post are already posting things like it's gone too far. It's like it's been 6 weeks. Like and like, like people, there's not these mass lockups or something. Like it's literally just like women feeling animated by the recognition that we weren't alone. Um, and so yeah, so like the sort of sense that to offer testimony about this kind of suffering and how it operates sort of systematically and politically and historically. It does feel, I mean, it's been out of fashion forever, like we live in patriarchy. And anytime you offer this kind of testimony, it's out of fashion. It did feel for a brief gasp moment that maybe there was that energy for change. And I think part of what finally sort of made me feel like I needed to tell the story was really the way that the backlash was operative in literary criticism and literary circles. Um, which I guess this is how we can sort of tie back to your question about the title of the book, which was the Perel Segel essay in the New Yorker in 2021 called The Case Against the Trauma Plot. And I've talked about this in a number of interviews, to say that like this is not like a beef with her, like I have no beef with her. I had disagreements with the article. But really my discomfort was more sort of what seemed to be fomented by the article. And the way that other people followed in its wake and weaponized the language of that article, essentially to make sort of like literary critical or ostensibly like, how do I put this?
It created permission for people to like put forward anti-feminism under the guise of an aesthetic critique is what I
Yeah.
interpret it as. That article is creating permission for, not really doing itself so much, because the substance of that essay is very different than the way it was sort of deployed later.
Sure. Well, and Segel has like written elsewhere about trauma plots that she admires and thinks works well. Like it's not like I'm like, ah, yes, this is the anti-feminist person, and like she ruined it all or something like that. I do think, yeah, there was a level of like a sort of snowball effect in which, yes, people were suddenly able to make very anti-feminist, um, deeply silencing critiques about testimonial literature and art. Um, Again, like you said, sort of under the guise of like, this is a trouble of form, really. Like, this is a trouble of a kind of plot, as opposed to, I am suggesting that the answer to this trouble is like silence on the subject of sexual violence. And so like, I think once it felt like it was kind of like in my wheelhouse and a more like intellectual register, I saw that like I did have something to say because I kind of didn't see a ton of defense. I didn't see a lot of people coming to the defense of something. And it was also very easy for literary critics to sort of create this locus of, what's the word I'm looking for? They sort of like created a canon problem that essentially oriented around a single novel, which I think is like lazy literary criticism. Everyone suddenly was like, we're talking about the trauma plot and how it fails as a narrative maneuver, They were
Yeah,
all just sort of talking
life.
about a little
It's
life.
great, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, they were all just talking about a little life, and they were using it. And it's very easy to hate on something that like was an enormous bestseller that a lot of people loved and a lot of people didn't love, and to take that and use that as the locus of interest, and then as a way of sort of like generating this like more insidious, broad scale critique of narratives of sexual trauma.
Yeah, it's interesting the way that the backlash gets sort of laundered through various like channels of plausible deniability, right? But I'm interested in, and I should mention to our guests that we are going to open it up for a Q&A in a few minutes. I could talk to Jamie about this book forever. I'm obsessed with this book. I think it's really a tremendous formal intervention as well as just like a really excellent literary achievement. But I think something that you deal with very deftly is sort of refusing the misogynist prescription for the trauma plot, which is to be, permanently damaged and partial, right? There's a couple of moments in this book, and they're not necessarily in this like neat chronological order where like you go down into the underworld and then emerge like complete and transformed and healed. It's more true to life than that. You have one passage where you take a trip to Wyoming. I think it's like between when you're raped for a second time in Boston and maybe you had just moved to New York, but you go to Wyoming with some friends. And you just have this beautiful time where you can glimpse a version of yourself that is capable of being present and is not in constant pain and has access to this like joy and possibility for the future. And then actually another one of my favorite passages is when you like first start escorting and you talk about how the discovery of like sex work as a mode in which the parameters of entitlement, your own entitlement, actually become more clear because you have an opportunity to say no that you find gets respected because of the like formalized entitlement of the money. And I wanted to talk to you about how you come to possibility as you're writing this, and maybe just as you're living a life. How do we all heal? How do we heal from trauma, Jamie? Tell us all.
It's a yeah, I'm gonna cure everyone. I the moments that you referenced were kind of surprises to me, you know, like going to Wyoming did feel like this incredibly revelatory experience, kind of in a way that I didn't necessarily anticipate. I was actually quite nervous about that trip. My friend, one of my very best friends, had grown up in Cheyenne, and of course, like growing up as a little trans kid, the only thing I knew about that area of Wyoming was Matthew Shepard getting murdered there, you know? So like I had a little reluctancy about going there because we went camping in the mountains, and I grew up camping and I love camping, and that was great. But we spent some time in Cheyenne too, and like we had it ended up being so fun. I actually went to like the most amazing strip club in Cheyenne, Wyoming. It's closed now, but it was so Twin Peaks. It was like the most bizarre place. It was like probably my favorite strip club I've ever been to. Um, Not that I've been to like a million, but whatever. Um, and so yeah, but like that experience, it felt eye-opening to me. It also that was when another friend who we were on the trip with was getting into not necessarily sex work, although he had like I think experienced some of that too, but like working as an adult film actor. And that sort of like opened my eyes to a different relation to the sex industry, where I was like, oh, like he's doing this. His sort of participation to him was part of his art practice, you know? And yeah, just sort of being, I think so much of like the book also emphasizes the ways in which like I feel really sort of empowered in kind of like non-human interactions, like in sort of the natural world in relation to the flora, like in relation to animals, I have like, I think quite intense um, I don't know, joy in being around animals, like the birds on the fucking fire escape. My dog has been like such a healing being in my life. And then yeah, you know, so in terms of like, I guess what do I do to heal? I think there were sort of three things that it made it possible for me to write this book, and that made it possible for me to come out of it feeling a little more optimistic and open. And you know, one was therapy, and the second one was the writing, and like actually feeling like I was sort of, it sounds cheesy, but like I was taking control of this story that was about my lack of control. um, and then I was in a very, we broke up last year, but I was in a really healthy, what was for a long time a very healthy relationship with a man who loved me, and like kind of I learned in that relationship to really enjoy sex and not just perform the enjoyment of sex. Um, and those three things felt not necessarily like I forced any of them to, I mean, obviously I chose to get into therapy, but like sometimes you want to heal and you can't necessarily make those circumstances come into being, right? Like I felt very fortunate to end up in a relationship with someone who really loved me. Um, and I felt fortunate that I had the privilege of writing this book. And I felt fortunate that I ended up with a therapist who like really gave me a lot of space to process this shit. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, in terms of like what you should do to heal, I don't know if I have an answer for that. You know, like like for me personally, and this isn't going to work for everyone. I think, you know, I found that routine really helped. You know, like one of the things that I started doing during the pandemic was like every morning, the first thing I would do, I wouldn't lay around and rot in bed. I would get out of bed immediately and I would make the fucking bed, which would keep me from getting back in it. And I would go take my dog on a walk for an hour, or I would take her to the dog park. And like doing yoga every day, like sort of like it's again, this sounds cheesy and like self-help booky, but those are the sorts of things that I've found have been stabilizing for me. And then the rest of it is just like I kind of survived by the skin of my teeth, and like I feel lucky, and I feel yeah, just incredibly blessed that my life opened up rather than shutting down entirely, you know?
Well, I really feel blessed that you're here and blessed that you wrote this wonderful book, Trauma Plot, A Life, which everybody should go read and buy. It will change the way you think about violence. It changed the way I thought about violence. So we're going to turn to Q&A. We've got one question open. Everybody who wants to type a question, do so in the little Q&A box while you have your chance. But right now we're going to hear from anonymous attendee who says, Jamie, thank you so much for this book. And Moira, thank you for your wonderful questions. A more general question is, as a writer, what was your process of translating memory, the visual, auditory, tactile feelings, into the words? Do the words ever feel like enough?
That's a toughie. It's a good question. You know, um, in terms of the transformation of memory, I do feel sort of, you know, I guess again, this is a place where it's like, am I fortunate or did I do this like myself and like make a decision? But like I've been a diary keeper since I was very little. I'm very consistent, sort of like compulsive diary keeping since I was in middle school. Um, and being able to turn back to those records, I think, was incredibly useful for me. S- some memories are just more present, you know. I just interviewed this brilliant French author, Nej Sino, whose experimental rape memoir, Sad Tiger, incidentally came out on the exact same day as Trauma Plot. So but it was like, you know, there was some professional jealousy there for a while when I knew that they were coming out on the same day. But then, you know, I read the book and it's fucking incredible. And I ended up going to interview her at the French Cultural Institute uptown. And we had this incredible conversation. But she writes in her book, her book is about having been abused by her stepfather from the age of like 7 to until I think she was 12. And It was very strange. It was a very strange reading process too, because I was like, there are places where we're using like identical metaphors, like the language with which we're reckoning with this shit echoes in such powerful, almost shocking ways. But that ultimately made me feel like, oh, I'm not crazy, like, because even like having written the book and even like going through this process, the therapeutic process and talking about this for 10 years or whatever, there's still moments where you think, like, am I ever going to be believable? Do I even, like, did what happened to me matter? Like, or was I crazy? Like, whatever. And seeing that sort of the kind of like echolocation between these two texts, I was like, oh my God, like this is it truly is. And it's devastating too to think about how commonplace this kind of violence is. But also, it felt important to see like there's someone who was sort of thinking about this in very similar ways. She talks about the bizarre dimension of rape as if it's this kind of like alternate universe in which you like become exiled. And I kind of write about something very similarly in mine. But she also, sorry, that was a long way of saying that she also writes about the fact that like one of the things that traumatic memory versus sort of experiential memory for her was that like traumatic memory feels like this incredibly potent thing where you kind of remember everything about the horrible event. Um, and it blots out the rest. She talks about how she basically remembers nothing from the years that she was being assaulted except for the assaults. And I think in part, you know, it's possible sort of to see some of that in the book because I think like the rape events feel like the most sensory, some of the most sensory scenes in the memoir. Um, and Yeah, I mean, the mind returns to the things you don't want it to return to sometimes. But it did make, two of the times I was raped, I was roofied, so I was sort of in and out. But I still had these incredibly salient details that surfaced. And so, like, I don't know how to explain that. It's just like the way that my mind processed things. And then beyond that, like I often feel like that 10-year period that I am sort of intensely focused on in the book does feel like a fever dream. And a lot of it feels very inaccessible to me as sensory experience. But like thank God I had my diaries because I could turn to them and see what I was articulating about the day to day of that time. And it helped me reassemble things.
Before we go, I wanted to ask you quickly about Olive. You dedicate your book to Olive, your dog, and I wanted to talk to you because she's this moment of like,
Yeah, I think she's back here. Hold on. Let's
oh, I
see.
was hoping you would show us her. Oh, there she is. Hi, Olive. Um, and she's this like character of generosity and grace in the book. Can you tell us about what she did for the writing process and what she did for you?
Uh, yeah, she's everything. She's like a whole little universe. I I rescued her in God, what year is it? I think it was 2014. Maybe it was 2015. I've had her for 10 years, so whatever, do the math. Um, and I was like in a super dark place, and there was something when I decided to get I grew up with dogs, and I knew I wanted one. I wasn't allowed when I was in Boston. I wasn't allowed to have a dog at any of my apartments. And when I came to New York, the first place I lived, there were four dogs. I had five roommates and there were four dogs. And I started sort of just thinking like, okay, it's time. Like, I'm gonna do it. I'm an adult now. It doesn't matter how traumatized I am. I can take care of another creature. And I rescued her and she had been, like abused. This yeah, maybe feels a little like cheesy Lifetime movie too, but she had been abused and she was very traumatized. She was like maybe 6 months old. But I don't know, we kind of trauma bonded, I guess. Like I was in one of the darkest moments of my life and she was sort of like coming out of this horrible circumstance of abuse. And something about I do think that there was something about having to devote myself to the care of another in a way that I didn't really necessarily feel prepared for, like, as a romantic partner or something like that. I was too fucked up. Like, I was just not in a place where I was able to give myself in that way or to trust anyone in that way. But I was able to sort of have this incredibly beautiful relationship with her where I was like, I got to be a mom too, which like I can't have kids. Um, and being able to have that dynamic with her and to sort of devote myself to ensuring that like another being is taken care of, is fed, is walked, like those sorts of things. That's another sort of form of routine that felt very healing. Um, and yeah, she's kind of been like my whole world for a really long time. And in the writing process, like she was the one who was I'm sitting at the table and she would be at my feet and like curled up against me, or I would be in bed writing and she would lay next to me, and just sort of having her as I don't want to make her sound like an accessory, like she is a creature. She has autonomous feelings and desires and needs and whatnot. And I think that's also very beautiful. But yeah, it's hard to, it's in many ways difficult to articulate like our relationships with animals because the animals can't speak back, like they can't articulate how they imagine us, but like being the caretaker of other creatures and sort of opened me up to feeling like I was able to be with others sort of more generally. Um, yeah, I don't know. She's like one of the greatest aspects of my life.
I think that might be all we have time for, but Jamie, I want to thank you so much for your time and for your generosity and for your book, which I just really can't say enough about. I think it's absolutely such an accomplishment. It's so beautiful, it's so precise, it's so intelligent, and I'm really grateful for the book and for your time today. And thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank you, Moira. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.